Shabbat Shalom. One Yom Kippur when I was a kid, a friend of mine was fetching in shul, as kids do, and her father turned and gave her one of those dirty looks and said in a line that was then quoted in my household for years thereafter, "It's Yom Kippur. The adults are hungry, the children are bored." And there was probably a subtext that maybe the adults were bored too, but I digress. So you can imagine that I was very surprised when I learned the following Mishnah from the end of Tractate Ta'anit in the Mishnah. Amar Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel, Lo hayu yamim tovim liYisrael kachamisha asar ba'av uchyom haKippurim. Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel taught, there are no days as joyous for Israel as the 15th of Av and Yom Kippur. For on those days, the daughters of Jerusalem would go out in white garments, which they borrowed so as not to embarrass those who didn't have any. And it goes on to say, the daughters of Jerusalem would go out and dance in the vineyards. And this is on Yom Kippur afternoon, right? Or no, on Yom Kippur. They would go out and dance in the vineyards, and they would say, "Young man, lift up your eyes and see what you choose for yourself. Do not set your eyes toward beauty, but set your eyes toward a good family, as it is written," and then it quotes from Eshet Chayil from Proverbs. Sheker hachen v'hevel hayofi, isha yirat Adonai hi tithalal. Grace is deceitful and beauty is vain, but a woman who fears the Lord, she shall be praised. Okay, that sounds just like Yom Kippur, the way we do it, right? The Yom Kippur afternoon Sadie Hawkins dance. Dated reference right there. In fact, there are a few resonances of this. This practice may be the origin of the traditional Torah reading for Yom Kippur, for Yom Kippur afternoon at Mincha, not the one that we do here, which is Vayikra's list of prohibited sexual unions, right? You're going to go out and have some fun, don't have too much fun. And many of us have also preserved the practice of wearing white on Yom Kippur, whether that is in the form of a kittel, or in the form of a white dress, or let's say light-colored chinos and a white polo shirt. That's how I roll. But the fact that they would wear borrowed clothing drives home the point that this Yom Kippur singles meetup was not intended to be a fashion show. Possibly a controversial statement at some shuls. Okay, now the reason that I'm bringing this up today, of all days, is that the 15th of Av, Tu B'Av, is the other holiday listed on that list, and that is coming up this Wednesday, right after we had Tisha B'Av this past week. Tu B'Av is one of those minor holidays. If you come to Minyan on Wednesday morning, you'll see that the main way in which we nowadays observe Tu B'Av is that we skip Tachanun. That's about it. But that's not all there is to it. There are many communities to this day in very diverse segments of the Jewish world that do continue to observe this Tu B'Av as a sort of Jewish Valentine's Day, ranging from Haredi communities to secular Israeli communities to fundraising emails about Jewish singles events. But what I want to talk about is the mythical origins of this Tu B'Av holiday, and what is its connection to Yom Kippur, and how the origins of this holiday, as told in the Midrash, will help us maybe learn something new about Yom Kippur. So there's a lengthy passage in Midrash Eicha Rabbah that comments on this Mishnah at length. And it starts by asking the following question. Bishlama Yom Kippurim. Granted, this is clear for Yom Kippur. Yom Slicha v'Chaparel Yisrael, Yom Shenitnu bo Luchot Achronot. For it's a day of forgiveness and atonement for Israel, and, following the rabbinic understanding of the chronology, it's the day on which the second set of tablets were given, right? So our understanding is Yom Kippur is the day of forgiveness, because that's the day Moses gave us the second day of tablets, the second set of tablets, making up for the golden calf. Ella chamisha asar ba'av maihi. Like, what the heck is the 15th day of Av, right? So notice that in this text, it's totally uncontroversial and unsurprising that Yom Kippur should be described as the most joyous day of the year, one of the two most joyous days of the year. And the question is, what on earth is this Tu B'Av thing? Okay? And the Midrash is then going to provide us with a whole bunch of answers. I think there are about 6 of them. Trying to situate Tu B'Av way, way back in Jewish memory, following what Noam Sienna taught us last month. I'm saying memory and not history here. And I'll mention what 2 of these explanations that they give are. Number 1, and this is the one that may connect to the sort of Valentine's Day aspect of the holiday. 2 weeks ago, we read in the Parsha that after this episode with Benot Tzlopchad, the daughters of Tzlopchad, there was a rule put in place that women who inherited property could only marry men within their own tribes. As some of us were talking about at Kiddush that day, when you think about it, this is a pretty lousy outcome, especially for those of us who have come to admire Benot Tzlopchad as sort of early feminist trailblazers in this story. And fortunately, sort of the Midrash agrees that this is a lousy outcome, but it stipulates that this rule was actually only put in effect for the desert generation, and not for all time. And the Tu B'Av marks the day that it was repealed, right? So it was like repeal of Prohibition Day, okay? And so there's a whole drosh there for another day. But now I want to get to the really wild part, and this is sort of the last of the reasons that is laid out in this in this text, and so it's kind of the punchline. And it's a little deep and a little creepy. So so hang on, hold on to your hats here. I'll read this in the text. Rabbi Avin and Rabbi Yochanan said, Tu B'Av, is the day that the digging for those who died in the wilderness was halted. What does this mean? Rabbi Levi said, every eve of the 9th of Av, every Tisha B'Av, Moses would dispatch a herald to the entire camp, saying, go out and dig. And they would go out and dig graves and sleep in them. In the morning, he would dispatch a herald saying, rise and separate the dead from the living. And they would stand and take themselves out. 15,000 were subtracted every year for a total of 600,000 as the desert generation dies. Remember, we were told 600,000 men. Salem talked about this last month. There's a midrash that only actually the men of the generation died out. And they would all die on one day. And they would all, this is creepy, right? This is creepy. They would all lie down in their graves and then they would get up in the morning, okay? In the 40th year, the text goes on and says, the last year, they did this again, and everyone found themselves intact. They said, it appears we were mistaken in our calculation of the date. We had the date wrong, okay? And they did the same on the 10th, the 11th, the 12th, the 13th, and the 14th. Every night they would do this. And when the moon was full on the 15th, they said, it appears that HaKadosh Baruch Hu has canceled the decree from upon us. And they declared it a holiday, a Yom Tov. So I'm just going to let this imagery sit with us for a minute, because this is a little bit dark. And there are an awful lot of parallels in history and memory that go without saying here. And as I said, I found myself thinking about this in Salem's Drosh last month, in which she described the book of Bimidbar as a 40-year death march. And it seems in this story that the people have actually forgotten that it would only be 40 years. It seems like they've maybe even forgotten that they weren't all going to die in the wilderness and they were ever going to get to the land. They've given up any hope of brighter things to come. And it's only in this moment when they realize, oh, wait, we're not going to die tonight, that they have this holiday of Tu B'Av, okay? And what really jumps out at me in this story is this language of canceling the decree. It says, Bitel ota kazera, which is the same kind of language that we use on Yom Kippur, right? You know, Tshuva, Tefillah, Tzedakah, Ma'avirin, Ro'ag Zera, right? Tshuva and Tefillah and Tzedakah, like, nullify or, like, lessen the severity of the decree. And I want to argue that the whole point of this intense story is to try to deepen and explain these connections between these two seemingly unrelated holidays, Tu B'Av and Yom Kippur. One of the dominant themes of Yom Kippur, or maybe even cliches of Yom Kippur at this point, is that it represents some kind of a brush with death. We fast. We starve our bodies. Some of us wear kittles, which are burial shrouds. We sing Unatana Tokef, as I just said, who will live and who will die. And I'm thinking here of my grandmother, Zichrona Levracha, who was not religious, was not a shul goer, and she found shul on Yom Kippur to be not only boring, but also totally terrifying. And she wasn't wrong. It is pretty natural for Yom Kippur to be a somber and maybe even a scary day. And that's why the Mishnah's description of it that I read before, as the Yom Kippur is the most happy day of the year, sounds totally out of left field to our ears. And with that in mind, we now see how radical a claim this midrash is actually making. Tu B'Av, in this telling, is one of the most joyous days of the year, precisely because it is about a viscerally terrifying brush with death that ends in a moment of divine forgiveness. And so too is Yom Kippur, right? The connection that is being drawn here is that Yom Kippur and Tu B'Av are both about this brush with death, and they are both about forgiveness and possibility. And that, and not just the dancing in the fields, is what makes them the most joyous days of the year. Now, the part of the Yom Kippur liturgy that, for me, captures both sides of this story is Seder HaAvodah, the reenactment of the service of the Kohen Gadol, which for me is one of the most powerful parts of the service. For those of you who've been outside of the Chavurah Minyan, where I've had the honor of leading this, and I'll be doing it again this year, you've seen that we've done this in a fairly expansive style, which is a euphemism for long. Maybe in a style that I picked up at Kehilat Hadar in New York City. And although it's an awful lot of text to get through when we do the whole thing aloud, it becomes this incredible piece of immersive theater. It transports us back in time to the Beit HaMikdash, to the temple. And as Rabbi Professor Laura Lieber taught in a wonderful shiur about this 2 years ago, this is exactly what this text was intended to do back when it was written back in the 6th century or so, as a sort of piece of theater. And if you know, both in sanctuary and the way we've done it out in the tent, people are bowing down. It's like you're there, okay? And by the way, I'll mention that Laura Lieber is one of the world's leading experts on this type of liturgy, another typical Beth-Elian. So Seder HaAvodah hits all of the notes here. It hits the lows and the highs, and it hits the brush with death, and it hits the joy when it passes. It may be odd to describe it this way, but the whole service is a white-knuckle ride of terror, where the slightest wrong move could result in the Kohen Gadol getting zapped like Nadav and Avihu. Or, if we don't want to read it quite so literally, I'm sure Eric will agree with me on this, knowing that the entire community has placed its trust in your leadership is just as terrifying as getting zapped. And all of the micro details that we read in the course of this part of the service, ranging from how the Kohen Gadol's underlings would drill him and quiz him on the procedures in the week leading up to the event, to the way in which he would take off his clothes and bathe and put his clothes back on, and it repeats it over and over again, and the blood and guts of the sacrifices, and the counting aloud, achad, 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 as he dashes the blood on the curtain, are part of building that tension and terror in the story. And when he emerges safe and sound, which somehow indicates that his prayers for atonement on behalf of the people have been accepted, whatever that means, the text tells us that he would throw a huge celebration, a Yom Tov, exact same language that we've heard before. In the traditional text, this comes through in the explosively joyful piyut called Mare Kohen, which I will never stop being mad at the editors of Machzor Lev Shalem for omitting, but this is why the good Lord created photocopiers. Right, the line, Emet man hedar haya kohen gadol b'tzeitomi beit kodshei hakodashim b'shalom b'lifaga. How wondrous was the appearance of the Kohen Gadol when he emerged from the Holy of Holies, in peace, without injury. If anyone is up for singing a little during Kiddush, count me in. Just like Tu B'Av in the Midrash, Yom Kippur here turns from a day of terror, terror of death, into a day of joy, precisely because it is a day of atonement and forgiveness. And if you want one more little Tu B'Av connection here, Alexandra and I used a melody from Ari Kohen as the grand finale of the Simcha dancing at our wedding, which when I pointed out to my dad, like, do you recognize this? It's the Yom Kippur song. He said, this is the Yom Kippur song? Like, yeah. So as I said, we'll sing in Kiddush. I won't subject you now. But as I said, I think this midrash is doing something really, really radical here in reinterpreting the connection between Tu B'Av, this obscure holiday, and Yom Kippur, the most famous holiday on our calendar, as both being fundamentally days of relief and joy. On Tu B'Av, like our mythical ancestors emerging from their graves and realizing that the 40-year death march is at an end, we turn the page from the grief of Tisha B'Av last week and look for glimmers of hope. It might be a little hard to find at this moment. And on Yom Kippur, we remember that we have Teshuvah and Tefillah and Tzedakah, which may or may not avert any actual decrees, but which somehow give us the strength to keep on living good and decent and holy lives, and thereby avert the severity of the decree. And that, to me, feels like something to celebrate with a lot of joy. Shabbat Shalom. Happy Tu B'Av.